Danielle, a black police officer recently appointed as the new chief in Atlanta, stepped into the courthouse that morning. She wore a simple black suit, no badge, nothing to show her status except her steady walk and focused gaze. The main doors clattered shut behind her. The room was already filling up, whispers bouncing off the old wooden walls. Some folks nudged their neighbors as Danielle passed by, searching her face for a hint of nerves, but she kept her chin up and moved straight to her seat at the front of the room. At the far side, Sergeant Jim Matthews stood with his arms folded and jaw tight. 19 years in uniform had given him confidence, but today it was thinly veiled as impatience. As Danielle approached on her way to the front, Jim deliberately stepped further into the aisle, making it clear that his standoff was no accident. Their shoulders brushed roughly, friction sparking in that small space between them. For a second, Danielle caught his eyes, cold, dismissive, the scowl of someone who didn't want things to change. He made a show of taking a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his shoulder, as if to erase her presence. The gesture was loud without any words, echoing in the silent pause that followed. A few nearby officers shifted awkwardly, glancing away, but nobody spoke. Danielle only steadied herself, sitting down slowly, quietly refusing to be drawn into the game Jim wanted to play. Danielle paused for a moment in the aisle, scanning the rows, but it was impossible to miss what had changed. Her assigned seat, which should have been among the senior officials at the front, was now tucked back by the women's restroom. It was in a spot near the edge of the room, far from any place of respect or authority. She looked around. Some of the other officers kept their eyes on the floor, clearly uncomfortable. Without a word of protest, Danielle walked to the back and sat down. Her poise never slipped, even as a few people exchanged glances. Jim, standing closer to the front now, made no effort to lower his voice. "Guess this kind thinks they get to show up in hearings too," he said, a mocking drawl dripping from his words. His remark didn't hang in the air for long. A nearby lieutenant let out a quick half laugh, the kind that's more about fitting in than genuine humor. The hush that followed was interrupted only by the hum of the security camera, which was angled straight at Jim. He rolled his eyes with exaggerated slowness and sneered, too confident to bother hiding his disdain. It was clear he never worried about the consequences, not as long as the target of it all was someone outside his circle, someone who looked like Danielle, and especially not someone who refused to be shaken by it. Once the hearing was done, Danielle walked out into the courthouse hallway, the old marble floors sending the sound of her footsteps ahead of her. The corridor stretched long and empty, but it felt like every step she took told the story of how things had gone inside. Some staff hovered by doorways, pretending to be busy. At the far end, Jim leaned against the wall like he owned the place, relaxed in a way that let everyone know he was in no hurry. He held a coffee cup in one hand, sloshing it just a little as he watched her approach. As Danielle drew closer, Jim turned just a bit to block more of the hallway, not bothering to move out of her way. "Assistant," he barked, launching the word with a sharp snap. He didn't use her name, didn't even bother with a polite, neutral greeting. His voice was the kind that was used to getting what it wanted right away. Then he scanned her, openly, letting his gaze travel from head to toe without shame. It was like he was sizing her up at an auction, not speaking to another officer, let alone his new chief. With a quick, mocking whistle, Jim gave a little smirk and muttered under his breath that someone like her had no business being here at all. Danielle didn't break stride, didn't look down, but in the hush between them, it was obvious the fight for respect in this place had just started. Danielle kept her chin up and tried to walk past Jim without breaking stride. But he stepped forward, blocking her path and pointing down the hallway in the opposite direction. "You need to head to the guest section," he said, his tone making it sound more like an order than a suggestion. Danielle didn't let this throw her off. Calmly, she pulled out her invitation, the official document that stated clearly she was meant to sit in the fourth row, right among the senior officers. She handed it over for him to see, keeping her composure and not missing a beat. Before Jim could push the issue any further, a clerk in a navy blouse hurried over, her heels clicking against the floor. She glanced at Danielle's invitation, nodded with a tight smile and said, "There's been a small mix-up. Could you please return to the seats in the back?" Her voice was polite, but her eyes didn't linger. She was just moving problems out of her way. Jim's smirk widened as Danielle was once again directed to the back. He leaned toward a nearby lieutenant and said, almost under his breath, "Everyone thinks they belong here just because they can wave a piece of paper." He said it as though he was commenting on the weather, but the meaning was unmistakable. The others standing nearby exchanged glances, no one laughing, but also no one willing to speak up. The silence felt heavy, and Danielle could sense it. Not everybody in that courtroom actually believed each person should have the right to be there. Yet Danielle squared her shoulders, knowing her place couldn't be defined by how quietly others tried to exclude her. Danielle moved down the hallway, once more holding her file close, her shoes silent against the polished floor. But as she neared the double-glass doors, Jim positioned himself right in her path. His shoulders seemed wider than usual, standing square so she would have to brush against him just to get by. He didn't step aside, didn't move. It was as though he wanted to make her stop and acknowledge his presence. Without asking or even saying a word, Jim reached out and placed his dry fingers on the edge of Danielle's folder. He left them there a second longer than necessary, like he was daring her to pull away first, or maybe showing everyone around that he believed he had the right to touch her things. He leaned in just slightly and said, "I don't answer to your kind." He spoke with a slowness that made each word feel like a small cut, deliberate and mean, making sure Danielle couldn't ignore the message. Every syllable hung in the air for a moment, settling heavy between them. A young officer walked by at that exact moment, eyes wide as he saw what was happening. Danielle caught his look just for a second. The young man paused as if on the verge of speaking up, but then broke eye contact, pretending to check his phone, head bent low. The moment passed, and Danielle realized how alone she was in that hall, surrounded by witnesses who weren't willing to stand with her, at least not yet. Feeling the hallway close in tighter, Danielle stood her ground even when Jim made no effort to move. Suddenly, his hand shot out and grabbed the strap of her bag, tugging it toward him with a quick, careless jerk. He didn't pull so hard that it hurt, but there was no mistaking the act. It was done right out in the open, a white man in a tired, faded police uniform gripping the bag of a black woman who outranked him, making no excuses and not bothering to hide any part of his plan. He poked around at the opening of her bag as if he needed to check something, his version of just making sure. But his true intentions were crystal clear. "Should count yourself lucky I didn't call security," he said, following the words with a rough, wheezing little laugh. It was the kind of laugh that told Danielle this was all a joke to him, that he thought he was being generous by not making things worse. His grip finally loosened, but he waited, expecting her to jerk the bag away or fire back with a sharp word. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't yank her bag back. Instead, she just looked him in the eye. There was no anger or fear, just a calm that made Jim's show of power feel as small as it truly was. Her face, steady and unreadable, was marked by a quiet strength, the kind that tells a person everything they need to know, without a single word exchanged. As Jim continued with his swagger, throwing out more comments about fake invitations and why Danielle should be grateful, he hardly noticed that she had quietly tilted her phone in her hand. With one small, practiced motion, she pressed the record button. Every word of his, the threats, the twisted jokes about her documents, the remarks layered in contempt, filled up the memory of her phone. The words were no longer lost in the hallway air or shielded by silence. Now they waited, caught in a digital record that couldn't easily be denied or twisted. Jim moved away after a final sneer, loudly greeting someone farther down the hall so all could hear his side of things, not sensing he was leaving traces behind. Danielle didn't look at anyone else as she walked back to her seat at the back of the courtroom. She sat quietly, opened her folder again, and pretended to read another page of notes, even though her mind was racing. Outside, everything seemed to go on as it had before, staff shuffling papers, shoes echoing, the low hum of voices. But in those few minutes, something important had shifted. Jim's hand had grabbed her. His words had tried to cut, but now she held a record, word for word. She waited, patient, knowing sometimes silence holds the sharpest truth of all. The heavy, wooden doors swung open, interrupting the usual courthouse chatter as Jim strode inside. This time his walk had lost a little of the swagger. He scanned the waiting room, and the moment his eyes landed on Danielle, a flicker of something unsettled crossed his face. She was still there, calm and steady in her seat, shoulders back and eyes straight ahead, refusing to shrink or disappear. For all his bluster earlier, what really seemed to bother him now was that she did not flinch and she did not fade away. Without warning, Jim stormed across the aisle, his boots clapping against the tile. He shoved Danielle hard on the shoulder, so suddenly that her folder tumbled out of her hands. Papers shot across the floor, scattering in wild arcs like torn leaves in a storm. The force of his words matched the push, his face red with rage. "I don't take orders from anyone out of uniform and the wrong color," he bellowed, spit flying with the shout. Everyone nearby fell silent. Even the judge looked up, stunned, mid-sentence. For a moment, no one breathed or moved. Then, quietly but clearly, someone in the crowd lifted their phone and started recording, their camera focused on the chaos exploding in front of the entire court. After the blow, the courtroom, air grew heavy as everyone watched Danielle. She did not rush or scramble. Instead, she knelt down, careful and methodical, picking up each scattered paper one by one. Her movements were steady, measured, almost peaceful, as if she wanted to show that nothing would force her out of control. In that moment, her silence was louder than any protest. She offered Jim no response, no glare, no words thrown back, not even the smallest sign of anger. She barely glanced up, and when she did, her face was so still it seemed to draw all the energy away from Jim, leaving him suddenly out of place, his earlier force turning to emptiness. Judge Harris, well known around the courthouse for keeping his distance from everyone's emotions, finally spoke from the bench. "Would the chief like a recess before the hearing resumes?" His words echoed across the room, each person turning instinctively toward Danielle with new attention. People exchanged brief, sharp glances as the reality settled in. Jim looked at Danielle, searching for anything he could hang on to, but she remained seated, her hands resting calmly on her knees. Without a trace of drama, she reached into her inside pocket, pulled out a small, worn leather wallet, and flipped it open. Held up at chest height was her badge, with the words, "Chief of Police Danielle Brown," printed in crisp, bold letters. The silence broke, but this time it carried a whole different meaning. Danielle stayed completely composed as the room's focus shifted. She stood up, softly brushing the last speck of dust from her slacks, and faced the judge. Her voice was even as she said, "Judge Harris, I am here today only to observe." That simple statement carried more weight than any argument or shouting ever could. It instantly exposed the emptiness behind Jim's show of power. He did not step forward or back. He just froze, chest barely moving, hands starting to shake. As the silence pressed in even tighter, no one else dared to speak. The small audience, used to watching Jim throw his weight around for years, now saw him in a stark new light. All at once, people recognized the truth. The glances they had exchanged, the times they had looked away, pretending not to see, the laughter they had shared at his side. Now there was nothing left to hide behind, no jokes or uneasy grins. The looks on their faces had changed. Where once there had been silent agreement or shared discomfort, there was now something sharper, a sense that things could not go back to what they were. The blame for allowing things to get this far no longer belonged just to Jim. Word traveled fast in New York City. Within less than 60 minutes, a shaky phone video of Officer Jim Carter shoving Chief Danielle Brown had raced across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and every group chat from Brooklyn to the Bronx. The video was clear, with Jim's angry shout echoing in the courthouse, "I don't take orders from anyone out of uniform and the wrong color." In a matter of minutes, hashtags popped up, each one pointing straight at him, and by extension, the system that let him get this far unquestioned. Then, just as people began to process the fresh footage, another video surfaced. This one pulled from the depths of forgotten hard drives and old private feeds. In the clip, 3 years back, Jim stood in a stuffy precinct conference room, his face red and voice raised at a young officer. "If you aren't going to cooperate, maybe you should go back to the projects where you learned that attitude," he barked. The officer in the video, a young black woman, the first lieutenant ever named to Internal Affairs, stood motionless, stunned by the words. Less than 2 months later, according to records now circulating online, she had asked for a transfer and quietly left her post, the past buried. For years, had now come crashing into the present for all to see. By sunrise the next morning, an internal document started quietly making the rounds through the inboxes of patrol officers, sergeants, and city officials. It was a letter, 7 heartfelt paragraphs, from a young officer who had only joined the department 3 years before. While it was never meant to be public, someone leaked it to the local press, and soon it was seen by thousands. The officer wrote, "I witnessed every moment and said nothing. Not because I agreed, but because I was scared. My fear let these things happen. I want to apologize not just to Chief Brown, but to myself for not standing up when it really mattered." There was no name at the bottom, just a blank space, but the honesty in those lines hit harder than any official statement could. It was a rare, raw admission from inside the police force, an acknowledgement that the silence of good people can sometimes do the worst harm of all. The department's inbox was overwhelmed as the message spread. The city's leadership couldn't look away anymore. And while the mayor's office fielded calls from angry residents, the city council was suddenly flooded by urgent messages, not only from voters or activists, but from the wealthy donors whose support kept the city's gears turning. Most didn't demand apologies. They simply wanted answers. Is this who we are? Is this what New York stands for? The pressure could no longer be brushed aside, even by those used to ignoring it. 3 days after the moment in court, Danielle Brown sat across from America in a plain studio, lit with even, unflattering light. There was no theme music or special introduction. Just a simple camera cut to her and Tom Keller, the network's no-nonsense anchor. All eyes were on her, waiting to hear from the woman at the center of every headline lately. Tom wasted no time with pleasantries. "Chief Brown, everyone has watched that video by now. The push, the words, all of it. But what stood out was your reaction. You said nothing. You did nothing in that moment when so many expected a strong answer. Why?" There was no hint of apology in his voice. Danielle looked right at him, steady and unblinking. She did not fidget or reach for her glass of water. She did not rush either. After a second or two, she replied, "I stayed silent so he could tell everyone exactly who he was." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a firmness that settled in the space between them. Tom, the crew, even the people behind the cameras fell quiet. Not because there was nothing left to ask, but because right then, it was clear her answer stood on its own. For a full minute, no one tried to fill the quiet. The short clip, only 13 seconds long, was all it took to light up every corner of social media. It had no fancy editing, no dramatic soundtrack, just Danielle's calm face and her simple sentence about the power of silence. Someone out there, probably watching in their bedroom, had added a caption underneath, "Coldest answer of the year." Within 6 hours, it had been shared over 1 million times, passed along by people sitting on buses, waiting for coffee, or scrolling before bed. Meanwhile, Jim Carter, who used to stride through precinct hallways as if they belonged to him, now found himself completely cut off. He was alone in his cramped New York apartment on the 8th floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes and old newspapers. The only light in the room was from his laptop, which kept looping that same clip. The glare outlined every line on his face, now drawn with worry instead of swagger. He gripped his chipped coffee mug, hands unsteady, but not because he was cold. It was just sinking in. No one was calling or texting him. No one wanted to hear his side, and there would be no more invitations to meetings or squad hangouts. Jim was isolated, a man known by everybody yesterday, now forgotten in a matter of days. Up on the 6th floor at NYPD's headquarters, things had shifted in a way no one could ignore. The door to human resources kept closing 13 times in less than 48 hours, each time marking a new chapter. On the table sat a growing stack of transfer requests. Every folder belonged to an officer who had once reported to Jim Carter. Most left the reason line blank, but one was blunt as ever. "I do not trust reforms built on emotional reactions to media pressure." It was a clear sign that not everyone felt the same about the changes, and old loyalties were starting to crack. Chief Danielle Brown received the first file at 8:02 that morning. She glanced through the top few pages, her face impossible to read. Without a sigh or any trace of frustration, she nodded at her assistant, asking for the full list to be printed and brought up. When the file, almost as thick as her thumb, landed on her oversized desk, Danielle picked up her black pen, sharp and steady. She signed each one without hesitation, no lectures, no efforts to plead with any officer to reconsider. Every signature sent a clear message. This was no time for second-guessing or holding on to the past. This was about moving forward, even if it meant doing so in silence. In the back corner of the admin floor, Lieutenant Maria Jackson sat at her desk, unable to stop looking at the letter in her hands. She had been pushed aside by Jim Carter, stripped of her supervisory role, supposedly due to not enough experience managing men. Maria had almost walked away from the force for good. There were days when she wondered if anything would ever really change. Now here she was, back at the job she should never have lost, thanks to a signature from Chief Danielle Brown earlier that morning. Danielle had issued dozens of transfers and reassignments, but on Maria's order she had scribbled an extra line in her sharp handwriting: "We start with those who were left behind." There was no fanfare, no apology in the words, just a quiet intent to rebuild piece by piece, starting with people whose trust had been taken from them. As Maria stood to head into her old office, now hers again after so long, a seasoned officer waited by the doorway. He had always been around, always kept his head down, once punished by Jim for supposedly lacking the discipline to lead. When Maria approached, he looked her in the eye and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. He did not say anything but nodded, just once, slow enough for her to realize he meant it. It felt like hope being handed from one generation to another, a small but real sign that maybe a new kind of leadership was actually possible. That same morning, just as Lieutenant Maria Jackson was settling into her restored office, the building's usual routine was interrupted by a buzz of incoming notifications. Social media was blowing up over a new video. It showed a rookie officer, barely out of training, standing at the plaza in front of headquarters, sunglasses reflecting the tall NYPD sign behind him. He pulled his badge off, dropped it right onto the sidewalk and used a lighter to set it on fire. The footage shook as whoever filmed it tried to steady their phone, but you could clearly see the flames and hear the sizzling metal. The young officer spoke directly to his phone. "This is not my team anymore." That one sentence caught everyone off guard. By lunch, it spread from precinct group chats to major news sites. It was the kind of moment people remembered, the sort that forced conversations in break rooms and living rooms all at once. Inside, in the public entrance hallway, something smaller but equally powerful happened. A new recruit poked his head over the reception counter and asked if Lieutenant Carter was still around. The receptionist, Mrs. Green, older and known for her quiet way, answered in a flat tone, "Maybe he still has the title, but he does not have the face anymore." Someone behind her caught it on their phone, the audio thin, but the outburst of laughter behind it echoing much louder across the lobby than any official announcement ever could. It was not just sarcasm, it was a sign that the culture was shifting, little by little, from the inside. 3 days slipped by quickly, and soon all eyes turned to a hearing set up on the 5th floor of the old Manhattan courthouse. Jim Carter strode in, but he was hardly the same man everyone used to watch command a room. He was dressed in a wrinkled gray suit, his badge and uniform long gone. His eyes darted around, landing quickly on the exits before finally settling on the polished table in front of him. Gone was the self-assured posture. Instead, he looked smaller, almost out of place, weighed down by the silence. Laid out on the table was a thick stack of papers, close to 200 pages, with a bold heading on the first page. Request for full re-examination of all disciplinary decisions signed by James Carter between 2012 and 2021. Even the most seasoned detectives in the department felt the weight of those words. The next few hours would not be easy for anyone. The room grew even quieter when the first witness was called. It was Henry Watkins, the retired Captain Carter, had threatened behind closed doors a decade before, now finally given the floor to speak. Henry walked with a slow, steady step and took his seat, ready to reveal details everyone thought would stay locked away forever. For once, Jim was just another man waiting for his past to catch up. Not long after the tense start of the hearing, something else set the city buzzing. Danny Brooks, an investigative reporter from the New York Times, sent out a quick message. To his editor, "We have the original tapes." There was no drama in his words, no splashy promise of scandal, just a quiet certainty that hit harder than any headline could. At 7:15 in the morning, the article went online with a title that stopped people scrolling: "The Carter Files, The Forgotten Tapes." What followed grabbed everyone's attention. The Times had pieced together 16 patrol car footage clips, all documenting Jim Carter's interactions with civilians over the last 12 years. 8 of these videos had never seen daylight. Nobody outside the department had even known they existed. 5 were marked as data lost in official files, erased from internal systems like they never happened. The last 3 had been submitted, along with formal complaints, but each case was dropped, written off as not enough evidence of wrongdoing. With the footage out, there was no more need for speculation or explanation. People watched frame by frame, hearing voices crack, seeing anger flare, and understanding how power could be used to make people small. These were no longer considered pieces of evidence. They became the final say, proof no one could ignore, not even the department itself. The city had to look at what it had let slide for all those years. The next morning, before the city was fully awake, Jim Carter made a Show of coming in early. 6:49, his steps echoing in the lobby. But all his old routines stopped short. The main entrance, usually open by sunrise, would not budge. A young security guard, face tense but unreadable, appeared from behind the desk and handed over an old spare key. He did not say a word, did not meet Jim's eyes. The message was clear. He did not belong here anymore. Jim slipped inside just once more, walking through the office he once ruled. The familiar black leather chair was spun around, nobody waiting for orders. Every desk drawer had been emptied. Out. He tapped his password into the locked laptop, only to see a solid red warning: user does not exist. No one lingered to watch, no one offered sympathy, and Jim realized everything had moved on without him. The department did not need a dramatic ending. Elsewhere in the building, Chief Danielle Brown stuck to her quiet ways. She clocked in on time like always, skipped any speeches, ignored the calls from the press, and just kept sorting files in. Her usual steady rhythm. She let the world speculate, never raising her voice. It was the kind of calm that made everyone pay attention. People could feel the truth working, even if no one shouted about it. In a city where outbursts usually turned heads, it was this steady quiet that said more than any public trial ever could.